this first video is, did the Roman Empire fall in 1922 AD? Or alternatively, why is history changing? For a long time, the history that school students in the West, especially here in the United States, were taught was that the Roman Empire had a very clear historical progression. We would start out in the Republican period, then you would move on to Julius Caesar, talk about the expansion and the rise of imperialism, and then we would learn that there was this time period that was filled with a lot of bad figures who are interesting for television, but they weren't very good leaders. People like Nero and Commodus. And then there was this steady period of decline of both the imperial power but also moral virtue. And then you had a total collapse that happened in the 470s AD when the Goths came in, sacked Rome, and took everything over, leading to the final end of Roman civilization. Now, if you went to school roughly from the 1980s onward, you probably learned something that was a little bit different. So you would have learned that the institutions of Rome and even the Roman Empire itself in name continued in the East for almost 1,000 years after the supposed final collapse of Rome. And you learned about the Eastern Empire, you learned about Justinian, you learned that things more or less carried on, but in the East, in the Greek-speaking world. But odds are that even if you did learn about all of that, it was as more of a footnote, and the primary takeaway that you were supposed to get from this entire story of the Roman Empire was one of stages of ascendancy and of collapse. And so in this video, what I really want to look at is, why is that? How did we start out with this very obvious narrative about Rome and believing that the Western Empire and its state was equated with the Roman civilization, but also how history can be seen to change in general, which is a process that's still ongoing, but despite those changes, why oftentimes these central driving narratives remain with us. History is often presented to us as a series of facts and accounts of things that definitely happened. This happened, these things happened. We don't really have room to question them because the people that we're getting these accounts from are treated as though they had no real agendas and there was no adulteration of anything that we're told. Now, we're often told the maxim that history is written by the victors. I don't necessarily find this to be a damaging take. I think that it gets a lot of people thinking about whether or not what they're being told is really what happened, or if it's just what the winners of the argument, the winners of the battle, the winners of the war wanted us to believe after the fact. However, historian Eleanor Janica has a quote that history is written by those who write. And what she means by that is that a lot of times the history that we're presented with isn't even necessarily what was given to us by the people who won the battle wanted us to think, but it's also given to us by those who want us to, are more contemporary to us than the original writers, who want us to believe in a certain narrative point of view about why things are the way they are and how they happened. Oftentimes it's the case that those who lost the argument initially get to develop entire sets of narratives around what they want you to believe that happened. And that ends up being the predominant narrative in society that gets to be passed on and told about. I am thinking here about the Lost Cause mythos is a very clear example of this, that's involving the Civil War. You also have things like the Clean Wehrmacht myth. And the reason that people get to do this is because history is not a series of clear cut facts of things that happened. History is a retelling of past events. The past and history should never really be confused with each other because history is it's malleable based off of who is allowed to do the retelling. And when we look at trends in society, sometimes it's much more convenient for people to change the narrative later in order to serve their purposes. When you're looking at the lost cause narrative, really that was the predominant way of teaching the Civil War in almost all of American society, North and South, from the end of Reconstruction until really in a lot of places it lasted until the 1990s, and a lot of the basic tenets of it are still embedded in people's minds, even though academically it's been disproven and dismantled. And oftentimes these narratives have a certain social power that keeps them in place. Well, first forms them, but then also keeps them in place and allows them to carry on despite the fact that alternative voices have come out to show that what is being taught is inaccurate. So that gets us to the section about historiography. Now, what is historiography? Historiography is the study of history, to put it as succinctly as possible. A lot of times people who go to school these days to become historians and study in their fields, they do learn a lot about a particular time and place so that they can be. But what they're really learning to do is to critically examine sources, go back to primary sources, work with archaeologists, and that's all within the field of historiography. And that brings us to our first mention of Edward Gibbon. Gibbon was probably the first modern practitioner of the field of historiography. Gibbon was very interested in his work and going back to primary sources, whereas historians prior to Gibbon usually just worked within the realm of narratives as they had been passed on, and then only occasionally referenced primary sources when they had those immediately available to them. Gibbon brought a different approach. He believed that if you wanted to be accurate about what you were retelling, you should go back and you should look at all the different primary sources that you can that give you the best idea possible about what was really going on during that time period, and not to rely on the hearsays that had built up through narratives over time. Now, Gibbon was writing at the end of the era that is oftentimes somewhat pompously called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment era was a period of time when you had a lot of academics and philosophers and scientists who were focused on going back to the fundamentals of nature, in philosophy and science, in architecture, and all kinds of different fields. And they placed a pretty heavy emphasis on sort of wiping away what they saw as the superstitious notions of the past and going back to original forms. And so Gibbon very much came up within that vein. And of course, his particular interest was in history. And so a lot of his historical analysis is based off of what was going on in a lot of other contemporary fields during his time period. And as I'd said, the Enlightenment philosophers tended to view the things that had come before them with a good deal of skepticism. They themselves saw themselves as bringing back these original fields of study in a more pristine form, going back to classical thinkers, classical thought, to sort of wipe away what they saw as a period of ignorance and superstition that had been the Dark Ages. And so naturally, this examination brought them back to a number of Roman and Greek philosophers, although it was oftentimes Greek philosophers as they were interpreted through the Romans. Now, from the perspective of Gibbon and a lot of his contemporaries, you can see how they would look around them and see that there had been a significant decline in quality of life between the collapse of the Western Empire and their infrastructure projects and the Roman roads and the open trade routes and the aqueducts and what was apparent as the quality of life through the Dark Ages. Gibbon and his contemporaries were also living in a period not too long after the 30 Years' War and the religious conflicts that had been responsible for immense damage throughout much of Western Europe during that time period of the 15th, 16th, and into the 17th century. So it's easy to see from their perspective how they would view the entirety of the age that came between themselves and the collapse of Rome as having been one vast period of ignorance and intolerance. And so a lot of the Enlightenment movement was, in fact, backlash to what had happened in the couple of centuries prior to the start of the 18th century and the start of the Enlightenment. And their view of what had happened between the 5th century AD and the 18th century AD was largely formed by what had come during that period of religious warfare in Europe. And I do want to emphasize that a lot of these guys were Western Europeans. They viewed all these things through the lens of someone who was living in Western Europe at the time. They didn't have a lot of access at that point to Eastern resources, Eastern European resources, and so a lot of what they had thought about the past was constrained by how they saw the world that was immediately around them. Now, before I had expressed a little bit of skepticism about the Enlightenment in general, I'd said that the term itself is somewhat pompous, and I don't mean to downplay the importance of the Enlightenment entirely or say that it had negative consequences, although sometimes those consequences were negatively felt by people who weren't in Western Europe as time progressed. However, I think that a lot of our view of the Middle Ages and how that's been filtered down to us through Enlightenment thinkers is inaccurate, and they tended to have very negative views towards of Western European civilization as it was prior to their own Enlightenment, and a lot of that was frankly colored by the world as it was in the 2 centuries prior to the rebirth of the Enlightenment. But it did bring in a period of study of scientific method, or the establishment of scientific method, and then the study of the natural world through scientific method. Now, before I go on to talk about some of the more negative points about Gibbon, I do want to give him his due. He was very important in the field of the study of history. As I said, he established a lot of the very, very basic parameters for the study of historiography, and his emphasis on going back to original sources, primary sources, and digging through past narratives has been emulated by every serious historian since his time. I had mentioned before that there was not a lot of access to Eastern European sources in the time that Gibbon was around, and so I wanted to explain this in brief. Much of this was due to the, at that point in time, closed-off nature of the Ottoman Empire. A lot of these Eastern Greek sources were behind the walls of the Ottoman Empire. It was not always this way. There was a bit more of a free flow of trade. There was more religious openness and tolerance, more social tolerance in the Ottoman Empire when it first started out. However, after the period of European colonization and after European sailors discovered that you could just go around Africa to get access to goods that used to have to flow through the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire went through its own period of decline and internal social strife, and then became quite isolated from the rest of the world for a long period of time. And so the viewpoints that a lot of people had of Greek philosophy, Greek life, both before the rise of Rome, but then after the collapse of the Western Empire, was largely filtered to them by Roman sources, and how the Romans viewed Greek life, and how the Romans viewed Greek institutions. During the Renaissance period, there was a little bit of traffic of original primary Greek sources that came back through trade, but then also through the Crusades. But for the most part, there just was not a lot of availability of Greek sources. And so philosophers from that time period, or historians, tended to view Greece rather negatively because, frankly, that's how the Romans viewed Greece. And they tended to also be fairly disdainful of the Greek-centered Mediterranean world. And then this cultural current, this fact of history, also influenced a lot of Gibbon's writing as well. So who was Edward Gibbon? Gibbon was descended from some minor nobility, having been born in the early 18th century. Due to the good graces of some of his relatives, although he personally did not come from a very privileged background with his immediate family, he was able to attend some good schools. Eventually, he would go on to become a member of Parliament as a Whig, although, like a lot of people who started out flirting with a lot of these Enlightenment ideas, he was not a radical Whig, and indeed, had he lived longer, a lot of his contemporaries, like Edmund Burke, later, and Lord North, who he was a personal friend of, who actually switched over during his lifetime, switched from becoming a Whig to a Tory. But a lot of people who were similarly situated to him did make the switch from sort of liberal politics into a more conservative politics. Burke, of course, is the grandfather of modern conservative thought. Gibbon went to Oxford, and while he was there, he kind of flirted with Catholicism. He was seen by a lot of his contemporaries at the time as being sort of dangerously papist, but like a lot of children of nobility, he went on a European tour, and this is quite common during the time. And part of this tour was to go to Rome. Even though England had officially disconnected from the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of them did go to Rome just to see the sights. And his sort of seminal thought, as he put it, on the decline of Roman civilization into sort of this superstitious barbarism started when he had visited the Roman Forum. And seeing the great ruins that were there, and seeing the neglect that they were under, he also viewed a group of barefoot monks who were walking towards the Temple of Jupiter. And he immediately became disdainful towards their superstitions as contrasted to this greatness that he saw before him. And so from there he started thinking about, well, how did we get from this to where we are now? And that's where he started to form his thoughts, and later he turned those into his work. And so he set out to create one cohesive narrative of how the Roman Empire itself, going from the height of the imperial age, went from this grandeur as he saw it to the ruins that he was now seeing in the Roman Forum, and to explain the great sense of loss that he felt in what he was seeing at that moment, at that time. The other thing to mention about Gibbon, just to circle back around to something that I had brought up before, in terms of the age that he was living in, was that it wasn't just the Enlightenment that was affecting him. As I've mentioned, a large number of Gibbon's contemporaries in Parliament initially started out the age as more liberalized Whigs and eventually made the transition into far, far more conservatively minded Tories. Now, a large part of the reason for this was empire. We're at the start of the British Empire, which would eventually become a world-spanning entity, and the interests of empire, the interests of commerce, were starting to have a mental effect on a lot of people who viewed themselves as being part of this liberty-loving, civic-minded tradition, certainly those in Parliament. And I want to stress this was a Parliament at the time that was mostly made up of very wealthy landowners and merchants, that was elected almost solely by those who owned land, and where a number of these constituencies only had a few hundred people, if that, who were even eligible to have the vote. And so, especially in the House of Commons, a lot of these people saw themselves as embodying this civic virtue, this tradition of civic virtue for Great Britain. It was not yet the United Kingdom. That wouldn't happen until later. But they saw themselves as being the vessels of civic virtue for Britain and for the British Empire. But then they also had this competing interest of wanting to ensure that their fortunes continued. And so a lot of them, in order to synthesize that idea in their head, started to transition to becoming more conservative leaning. But the thought of empire and how empires rise and how empires fall was very much inside of Gibbon's thinking about the world at the time. And so if we look at all these things, what we really see that Gibbon was writing about his own time and his own feelings about that time. And so while his work was about the Roman Empire, a lot of what he was writing about had more to do with his feelings about his own experiences in the times that he was living through. Now, the first edition of Gibbon's first volume of work came out in the year 1776. And this was very important. This was a real hinge point in history when lots of things were happening. There was a lot of exploration of new thoughts and new ideas and forms of government. And so Gibbon's work became incredibly influential, not just on thinkers in Great Britain, but also in France and, of course, in the United States. And a lot of his thoughts on civic virtue and the rise and decline of empires and his emphasis on historical cycles ended up making its way into the thinking of a lot of the revolutionary, sometimes revolutionary needs to be in quotation marks there, but revolutionary thinkers in not just his own country, but also across the world where they had access to his works. Gibbon's work on the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is quite extensive. It comes out to 5 volumes eventually, and it would be quite unreadable but for the fact that his prose are excellent. If there is one thing that people can copy from Gibbon, aside from his emphasis on going back to primary sources, it's his prose. The man really knew how to make a point. And as I had alluded to before, the point that he was trying to make through his work was that the decline and fall of Rome was caused by a decline of civic virtue and civic participation and interest in civic life, and the rise of monotheistic religions, in particular Christianity. A number of those who look back on Gibbon today say that Gibbon in his work presents a very clearly identifiable villain when it comes to the collapse of civic life in a Roman civilization. And the villain that Gibbon assigns is Christianity, as you could probably expect from the things that I've already stated previously. Gibbon lays out a few central theses, I believe 5 in total, about Christianity and about monotheism more generally, that I'll try to synthesize into some basic points. The first basic point is that Gibbon feels that Christianity and monotheistic religions and their emphasis on community causes people to ignore larger civilizational questions in favor of only focusing on their own salvation. The second issue that Gibbon presents in his belief is that Christianity encourages focus on miracles and on easy explanations for the world that discourage people from the type of intellectual rigor that he feels was present in a lot of those classical scholars of the Roman world. And so Gibbon feels that this is why a number of people in ancient Rome started to gravitate towards Christian religions and away from the old established civilizational traditions of Rome, and that this caused a lot of civil unrest, which eventually caused an unraveling. Had Gibbon applied some intellectual rigor of his own and not merely read the writings of a lot of the Roman cultural, civic, and governing elite, then he may have asked more questions about why people turned to Christianity. In Gibbon's mind, it was because Christianity presented a lot of very easy answers to questions, but he never asked why so many people were seeking new answers to old questions and why so many people felt that the answers to these questions weren't being provided by traditional Roman ways of thought and Roman norms. Now, there were large underclasses in Rome who were experiencing a decline in their own quality of life for a long period of time, and were seeing their own needs subverted by the needs of continuing to grow, expand, and defend the borders of the Roman Empire, which then, in turn, also benefited those people who were already firmly entrenched in society. And so even if you look past the vast differences in experiences of people who were living within the Roman Empire, not just class, but also large regional differences, and only look at what's going on in the upper classes, even there, Gibbon is often criticized for creating something of a Planet of the Hats. Planet of the Hats being a term that's borrowed from science fiction criticism. It refers to the tendency of science fiction, TV shows, and authors to create planets that seem to have only one thing that's going on, and there are no countercultural currents or differences of thought within that planet's society. There were a number of thinkers at this time who were quite critical of the way that the Roman upper class tended to behave and tended to ignore the needs of the poor. This can be seen in Plutarch's work, but then you can go all the way back to the time period of Julius Caesar when you see a sharp rise in the inequality in Rome and people trying to find answers to that. And of course, there were a lot of people who thought that Julius Caesar was the answer to that. So it's easy to see why there may have been a lot of people who were looking for alternative answers and were trying to find some sort of countercultural as we would call it now, experience as they lived in Rome. And there were a number of these different social movements that sprouted up. Another odd point that Gibbon makes is that he, in his mind, feels that there's a certain exclusiveness to religions like Christianity and Judaism, where they focus on themselves and they don't focus so much on the outside world and outsiders, and that this exclusiveness may also have been attractive to converts. This kind of flies in the face of a lot of what we know about the early spread of Christianity and how it spread. And even during this time period, Judaism was quite open to new converts within the enclaves of the Jewish diaspora within the Roman Empire, although because of dietary restrictions and other life restrictions of Judaism, it may not have been seen as quite as tempting for a lot of people to convert over to Judaism, but they did have converts. But if you have all of these people who are out here looking for alternative answers to life questions that can't be found within the old civilizational traditions of Rome, then that would suggest that there was an inadequacy and a breakdown in those traditions that then in turn drove a lot of Roman citizens to look for a society and for a religion and for a basis of thought that put a lot of emphasis on goodness, on loving your neighbor, and on the idea that there may be a reward out there for just being a decent person. And so, perhaps without intending to, who Gibbon really casts as the villain is social change, what we would call counterculture today. And certainly a lot of later people who would look at Gibbon's work in the 19th and 20th century read that from his work, that idea that, well, it's instability that's caused by countercultures that's the real villain for civilizational and imperial collapse. But that then gets us to the question of, was there even really a collapse at all? Gibbon certainly seemed to believe so. At best, he thought that the Eastern Empire, while he did write about it, was nothing more than a degraded form. But in reality, a lot of Roman traditions, a lot of Roman civilizational norms did live on. They just lived on in an evolved form and were transmitted down to Western Europe. The intellectual rigor that Gibbon often talks about was very much a part of medieval thinking, and a number of medieval Christian monks and also Jewish scholars and even later Islamic scholars carried on those traditions, and they built a lot of what they were doing off of the methods of observation and of thought that were passed on to them by the Western Roman Empire. And so the end of the Roman state in the West was not the end of Roman civilization, but because Gibbon is trying to set up this narrative of decadent collapse and historical cycles, he largely ignores this point in his own writings and instead moves forward with a narrative of total loss and total collapse as is convenient for him with the point that he's trying to make. And here I think it may be a good idea to pause for a minute to try to define some terms. The way that Gibbon used a lot of terms such as civic virtue and tolerance is different from how a lot of people would imagine using those words today in a lot of contexts. And so for Gibbon, a civic virtue is not going out and having a voter registration drive or participating in community organizations. Civic virtue for Gibbon means that regular people in society should subordinate their own desires and their own interests to what is in the greater good of the civilization. Gibbon feels that the problem in Rome is that too many citizens were just not allowing the political and cultural elites who were better educated to make dispassionate, logical, rational decisions that would better affect the course of the state of Rome, of the Roman civilization. And tolerance in Gibbon's mind has a lot more to do with the willingness of regular citizens to allow elites in society who Gibbon believed knew best because they had a firmer hand on the history. They didn't have as many emotions in their decision making process to guide society forward. And it's very convenient for Gibbon and a lot of his friends and contemporaries that they tended to see themselves as being more aligned with these elites in society who were capable of making dispassionate decisions. And as you listen to this, you again might hear a lot of sentiment that is echoed in modern far right movements and fascist movements. And this is no accident. Again, this is a way that Gibbon's thinking tended to inspire later currents of conservative intellectual thought. As I'd alluded to before, Gibbon's work was very influential on a number of his contemporaries and their thoughts on government. A lot of his ideas became incorporated into the writings and thinkings of the American founding fathers and influenced especially Alexander Hamilton with his arguments of the civic virtues of Roman republicanism versus the degraded virtues of Eastern thought and Greek democracy. Hamilton wrote about this in the Federalist Papers, but he wasn't the only one. A lot of America's founding fathers viewed themselves as inheritors to this legacy of civic virtue that was handed down from people like Cato, and they understood history in terms of, again, those civic virtues and those virtues needing to be protected against the masses. And as they started to form their own thoughts on government and actually crystallize a number of the institutions of the United States Constitution, they were thinking about what Gibbon had said about the fall and decline of the Roman Empire. They were thinking about these cycles of history, or at least they were thinking about history in terms of these cycles of rise and decline of civilizations, and they passed that idea on through the American educational system. As I had said, Gibbon himself was influenced in his thinking first by the centuries that had come just prior to the Enlightenment, when there genuinely was a good deal of religious intolerance, when you had a lot of religious wars in Europe, and when you had a lot of people who genuinely were very internally focused on their own salvation and were not focused on worldly concerns. And so, apart from that being somewhat inaccurate, and had Gibbon been more aware of what was going on in the Middle Ages, he may have seen things differently. He would have seen that there was no clean break with the end of the Western Roman state, and that indeed there was a lot of continuity between the newly emerging kingdoms in the West and the philosophical underpinnings of the scholars in the West. But also, had Gibbon lived for about another 20 years or so, then he would have had access to resources that were coming out of the East. The Ottoman Empire opened up again towards the beginning of the 19th century, and this caused a flood of availability of new sources from the East, and also a explosion in interest in Greek culture that was felt all over the Western European world and here in the United States. It came through in not just what people were reading, but also the fashion trends and the architecture. You see a lot of Greek revival architecture during this period. And what these sources told us was that indeed there was a lot of continuity between the classical thinkers and a lot of Eastern thought and the institutions of the Roman Empire and what was going on in the Eastern Roman Empire, or what was at that point called Byzantium. And this, again, also carried on through the Islamic conquests and influenced a lot of the thinking of Islamic philosophers in the Middle East. And after this event happened, we had a much clearer picture of what really happened after the alleged collapse of Roman civilization. And so throughout the 19th century, a new narrative started to form. We could now see that, in fact, a lot of Rome's governing institutions and Roman thought and Roman cultural norms actually continued on through the East, and they continued on through the collapse of the Western Empire as it was seen by those who were in the West, and the East actually carried on for a long time, nearly 1,000 years after the alleged collapse of the Roman Empire, basically continuing along the same way that Roman civilization and classical civilization had carried on before, building off of what was given to them, but the foundation was still there. And so now this alleged period of decline and collapse is carrying on for many, many, many centuries. And at that point, can you really call it a collapse anymore? You certainly couldn't in the East, where they were carrying on mostly with business as usual. And as I'd said before, there was a lot of carrying on with business as usual in the West as well, even though the Roman state no longer existed. And so while the Eastern Roman Empire certainly had its problems, has problems domestically, it certainly also has problems internationally, as it was constantly under threat from invasions from both the Rus and also later Islamic caliphates. The people who lived there still very much viewed themselves as carrying on the Roman customs and the Roman traditions. The court language might be Greek now, it's definitely a Christian state, but it's still fundamentally Roman with some changes. And so that gets us to our next point. When did the Eastern Roman Empire collapse? Well, a lot of people would say, obviously, it collapsed with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. And while, that's a very obvious event, with a solid end date that and a solid narrative that people can go by, what could be more clear cut than when the Ottomans came in and then Constantinople became Istanbul? It's also not true. Constantinople was still called Constantinople up until 1922 AD, up until Ataturk, up until the official end of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of the Turkish ethno-state that replaced the prior Ottoman domination of the region that had existed before that. And then, of course, the capital was moved to Ankara. And to respond to They Might Be Giants, that's when Istanbul became Istanbul and was no longer Constantinople. But that nomenclature for the city of Constantinople remained in place until well into the 20th century. So let's talk about some other things that remained in place until the 20th century. The Eastern Roman Empire wasn't conquered by, quote, the Turks, end quote. It was conquered by the Sultanate of Rome. Well, Rome? Yeah, these guys saw themselves as Romans. They saw themselves as the inheritors to the Roman Empire. They saw themselves with this final conquest as having inherited the Roman Empire. And the Turks who were living in Anatolia at that time had lived there for several centuries and become accustomed to Greek cultural norms. And their leaders saw themselves as inheritors to Greek cultural norms. And of course, at that point in time, Greek meant Eastern Roman. Sure, the religion and court language were different, But we've already seen that before. There had already been a major transition of the religion in Rome from the classical period into the Christian period, and the court language had already changed between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. But for the most part, they kept a lot of those Roman imperial institutions in place, and of course they evolved over time, but it was still built off of what had been there before. And by and large, they came in and they took over what used to be the Roman Empire wholesale. They had taken the entire thing, and granted, there were additional conquests that needed to happen later in order to solidify this takeover, but for the most part, the borders of the Ottoman Empire were not all that much different from those of the former Eastern Roman Empire. The markets were not all that much different. The social norms were not all that much different. The governing institutions were not all that much different. And so while these people were Muslim now, what they were still practicing was they were practicing Rome in their daily lives. They saw themselves as Romans. They saw themselves as inheritors to that Roman legacy. The first sultan of the Ottoman Empire adopted the term Kaiser for himself, which was the original Latin form of Caesar. And so these Roman Kaisers were sitting in Constantinople, ruling over what had been the Eastern Roman Empire for centuries after the Eastern Roman Empire is supposed to have collapsed. And so that gets us to the question of, well, why don't we see it that way? And of course, the answer to that question is that, well, here in the West, we think that there has to be some definitive point in history. And well, maybe Rome didn't end after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, but we got to draw the line somewhere. And so we decided to draw the line when you have this big event after which the official language and the official religion change. It's no longer Greek, it's no longer Christian. But is that what really defines a culture? I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, don't get me wrong. Language and religion are very important to a culture, but cultures also are built on institutions, both institutions of governance and also social institutions, philosophical institutions, many of which were so well preserved during this time period that we were able to get access to them. We being here in Western Europe and America, were able to get access to them again once the Ottoman Empire reopened. And yes, while they had evolved and they had changed, they had also evolved and changed from the start of the Roman Republic into the start of the imperial period, into what Gibbon identified as the decline and the fall, and then through to what we now identify as the Eastern Roman Empire. And so if you look at what a culture and society and what an empire actually is, its governing institutions, its social norms, a lot of that continued on more or less unbroken until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, until 1922 AD. Now, am I saying that this is now the definitive view and narrative viewpoint that you have to take of history? No, I'm not saying that at all. But when viewed from this angle now, you can see how a lot of the narratives that we've built up around history aren't nearly as clear-cut as they might seem, and that these cycles of rise and fall, decline, don't really have that much meaning. And so what I'm really saying is that all of this is arbitrary. And yet, so much of our view of history is built up around the notion of these very clear-cut starting dates and end dates and rises and declines and falls of civilization, and we don't really look at the reality, which is that a lot of this stuff is just people living their lives on the ground at the time as society changes around them. And so from this point of view, maybe you can have a better understanding of why history is changing. As I said, history changes with who does the telling and what's important to the person who's doing the telling of the story at any given time. As I had said before, history is written by those who write. And who gets to do the writing at the time often defines how history is related to us at any given time period, and the narratives that we get to hear about history. And oftentimes, those narratives hang on for a very long time because the people who are telling those narratives and benefit from the telling of those narratives hold power for a very long time. Gibbon's view of history, of the rise, of the decline, of the moral decadence, of the catastrophic end of civilizations and cultural norms, that narrative was taught for a very long time until well into the 20th century. And the reason that narrative survived was because, yes, it had a lot of institutional power through people having been taught that for a number of years, but it was also very useful to the people who got to write history and to be taken seriously. And so even when people can point at something and say, well, that's wrong, those narratives still have a lot of momentum. They have a lot of juice in society and in culture. People will get angry if you try to teach anything else. And so that gives us a new perspective on what's happening with changes in history and historical narratives. You go to someone who was taught about Western civilization in the 1980s, and they would laugh at a lot of those older notions of Rome having definitively collapsed in the 470s. And so the broader point that I'm trying to make here is not that Rome fell in 1922 AD. The broader point I'm trying to make is that a lot of this is arbitrary. And while a lot of times these narratives that we tell have a lot of cultural power, they aren't immutable. They aren't unchangeable. We hear a lot of people today who are fretting over historical revisionism. Well, I gotta tell you, bud, that history is being revised all of the time. Not just based off of new facts that are coming to light, but also based off of what people in a culture value at any given time. Now, that's not to say it's not important. It's very important. About a year ago now, I was planning this campaign that I was working on for Dungeons and Dragons, and I was having a conversation with someone I know, and I was explaining that for this world I was creating a sort of inaccurate version of history as it was told, and then a real version of history. And the person I was talking to, she asked me why I would go to all that trouble. And as I explained, it's important because what really happened tells us why institutions are the way they are. But the stories that have endured tell us what the people empowered by that history and empowered to keep shaping history, what it is that they want us to believe about why institutions are the way they are. And both of those things help you understand the world that you're in. And so while all this talk about start dates and end dates and eras for particular civilizations is arbitrary, the discussion itself is very important. The discussion itself tells us a lot about the world that we're currently living in. Here in the United States, a lot of what people believe about history and about the world that we live in right now is based on these discussions about rises and falls and declines of civilization and what it is that contributes to those cycles. And so right now on the screen, I'm showing a meme that a lot of you have seen. It's the strong men create good times create weak men create bad times, etc., etc. And this idea is foundational to a lot of far-right thinking here in the United States, but it was also foundational to a lot of fascist movements throughout the 20th century. And I think a lot of people who are viewing it with any type of objectivity, based off of what we know from the 20th century, would see that this is a pile of garbage. But yet this myth continues today, and so much of that is because of the narratives that were taught in our schools that were based on Gibbon's work. And so I hope that folks enjoyed this video. Hopefully it is the first of many that I intend to create. This was a rather lengthy first installment. It really gets into the weeds about a somewhat arcane topic, but I think that discussing this as a first topic sets a good tone for the rest of these videos and a good foundation, because a lot of these videos are going to be about challenging traditional historic narratives. Now, I doubt that this or any of the other videos I intend to make are going to convince anyone who does not want to be convinced. But if you do know someone who could be swayed and is sitting around asking questions about why the history they grew up with is changing, maybe send them this video. I think that focusing on this issue encapsulates sort of a lot of the broader points about historical narratives and why the history that they grew up with is not something that should be seen as set in stone. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.